Ganz egal, wer du bist oder welchen Lifestyle du lebst. Sei gut zu dir. Iss gut, wie du bist. Wir von Dean & David helfen dir dabei, dass du das genießen kannst, was dir wirklich gut tut. Frische Bowls, Salate, Currys und mehr. Mit vollem Geschmack und besten natürlichen Zutaten. Besuch uns in deinem Dean & David Store in der Nähe oder lass dir alles ganz einfach nach Hause oder ins Büro liefern. Unter deananddavid.com.
Erstklassisch mit Mischke, der musikalische Podcast des Hamburger Abendblatts.
Schönen guten Tag zu einer neuen Folge. Ich habe heute einen Gast, der schon öfter in Hamburg war, aber noch nicht bei mir hier in diesem Format. Er ist, ich weiß nicht, was die richtige Reihenfolge ist oder die beste Reihenfolge. Er ist Tenor, er ist Autor, er ist Historiker und er ist Brite, alles zusammen. Und bleibt eigentlich nur einer übrig, der das sein könnte, nämlich der englische oder britische Tenor Ein Bostridge. Ich bin in Hamburg in meinem Arbeitszimmer, er ist in London, soweit ich weiß. Also ich hoffe, die Leitung hält. Ansonsten, wir bleiben auf Englisch, weil Englisch. Ich hoffe, das ist kein Problem. Auf jeden Fall erstmal, hello Ein Bostridge. Thank you for taking the time and thank you for having me. And how do you do?
Nice to be here. I mean, sort of.
Okay. There's nearly no rules here, but there's one rule I'd like to stick to. I always start with a simple question or a tricky one. You can pick which one you want.
The tricky one.
The tricky one. Okay. I mean, both are tricky in a way, but okay. What's it like for an artist to live in the UK now, being an artist and being in a Brexit UK that's run by Boris Johnson?
It's a mixture of things. I think it's sort of embarrassing, but on the other hand, it's it's embarrassing and it's also mortifying, and so your defensive muscles start springing up. I don't want you to say, I was very much against leaving the European Union, but I don't want to be told all the time by people what a terrible mistake we've made. So, and they're right, there's lots wrong with the European Union. That's not really the point, though. I think it's a historic error based on, but you can see what it relates to in terms of there are all sorts of historical roots to it, but it's embarrassing, particularly embarrassing that it was brought about by somebody who doesn't really believe in anything. So what we've actually ended up with is a situation in which we've left the European Union, but I'm not sure there were any benefits to be had. But given that some people said there would be benefits, none of those benefits have been pursued. So all we've ended up with is as somebody said to me the other day, it's like we've launched a trade war against ourselves.
Yeah.
These stupid things too.
Yeah, Kennedy always talks about him in a column in a German newspaper as Popo the horror clown.
Yeah, I mean, he was at university with me, and he was a famous the sort of person you just wouldn't let near anything sensible. And the idea that that generation of people have ended up in charge is a horrendous one. But I suppose it's because the rest of us didn't bother.
But you didn't actually study with him, being in the same classes or something like that.
No, he was next door. I was studying history at St John's College, and he was studying classics at Balliol College next door. But he was
notorious.
Yeah, he was notorious, and he knew lots of people. I knew him, and he was always a shifty character, and he remains a shifty character. But he's going to get away. He's going to get away with it again.
Okay, I think we'll change the subject and get to nicer things then for a change. I wondered, how would you describe your voice? I mean, it's a tough question, but is there something that you really like about your voice that's unique in a way? Or is it up for me to say what's in your voice?
It's funny because I had a singing lesson today, so I'm sort of thinking about my voice a lot. I think I suppose it's clear.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the main thing that matters for me is that it's expressive. It should be expressive. And if it's, I think the thing with this new CD of Baroque stuff is that singing as a tenor doesn't have to be about singing loud and singing high notes. It's the expressivity and the relationship to the sound of words is very important, and I think that's something that my voice can manage. It's not a well-schooled bel canto voice, but you do all the time. You do have to work on that because that's the sort of basis of singing. So.
I found some articles about you where I read that you and your brother were terribly short-sighted, hopeless at sport, and bookish, and you were sent to sing in a church choir. And I wondered, how did you actually discover that you are a classical tenor and not the next David Bowie? Was it like a shock to you? Was it a sort of development that you thought, oh, maybe there is something in me that looks like a singer, like a classical singer? Or was it like from one day to the next, you knew this is what I want to become?
I don't think I ever wanted to become a singer really until it happened to me. I think I always sang. I was never really interested in pop music. I was very nerdy, we call it in English. So, like, I had, I had thick glasses and I read books and I wasn't good at sport and I liked classical music. And so I always sang, and I had a good voice at school, and I sang at school and when I was little, and then as I got older, I started singing Lieder, and but I don't think I thought about myself as a singer until I became a singer. It certainly wasn't a dream to become a singer. I mean, my great inspiration when I was a teenager was Fischer Dieskau, and so I never thought I'd become a singer because I wasn't a baritone, and I wanted to sing a repertoire in a language that I wasn't a native speaker of. So it seemed a bit hopeless to become a leader singer. So no, I never. There wasn't. I think it, and then becoming a singer just happened gradually. I think I just did more and more and more of it, and eventually it took over.
Mm-hmm. And you never actually studied music, as far as I know. And you said once, I've picked up a lot of things along the way. Was it really rubbed into you by other professional studied singers that you are sort of an outsider? You entered from a side door and somehow sneaked in? And
I wouldn't say it was rubbed in. I mean, the only time I've always really enjoyed being in operas and the sort of company spirit. And I mean, I haven't done it for quite a long time because of COVID. But there was just one occasion when I did. Thomas Adès wrote an opera called The Tempest, and I'd known Tom for a long time, and he wrote me a role in it, the role of Caliban. And there were lots and lots of tenors in it. There was, I can't remember. Anyway, there were, 4 other tenors at least singing really, really high, and I never felt as comfortable singing in the sort of high tenor way. So I did feel like a sort of, and they were all people who sang in opera a lot. I mean, Philip Langridge. Simon Keenlyside was in it. Other people who were, and I didn't sing in opera a lot. I'd sang in maybe one opera a year. So I did feel a little bit on that occasion like an outsider. But the funny thing was, I think it really related to the role, because as Caliban, I was a sort of despised outsider, and maybe I think you do in the rehearsal process, if you're at all sensitive, you do, and if it's a relatively long rehearsal period, you start picking up all sorts of weird psychological baggage which feeds your performance of the role. I mean, I found that particularly with working with, over the years that I worked with Deborah Warner, and she would use that incredibly, whether very cleverly or unconsciously, but she would use the dynamics of the rehearsal room to create the performance.
Mm. And you once wrote in an essay, as far as I know, that Mozart tenor roles are essentially boring, which is quite...
I didn't say that.
Okay, so so correct me then.
No, I mean the articles. I think it was one of those things where the person who wrote the headline,
mm-hmm.
I think entitled it "My Problem with Mozart," and I was simply saying that some of the roles are more difficult to bring off because dramatically they're not so interesting. I mean, if you take, one of the earliest opera roles I did was Belmonte in Elbphilharmonie, and everybody comes to hear Constanza sing Martin aller Arten, and it's an aria that's a sort of struggle, but it's a dramatic struggle. Whereas Belmonte has these, 4 very, 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 very beautiful arias which you have to sing, which are really difficult. but you have to give the impression that they're not at all difficult. And dramatically, he's not a particularly interesting figure. The interesting figure is Constanza in her relationship, with Belmonte and her relationship with the bassa and this sort of thing. And I think I particularly focused on the other role that I've done Idomeneo. I think that's a more interesting dramatic role. But the role of Ottavio, who in the first act it's an amazing piece of theatre. The discovery of the murder of the commendatore, and Ottavio's duet with Donna Anna. It's a most amazing piece of music theatre. And Dalla sua pace is an aria that comes out of the action in a very obvious way. But the problem is, I think, partly that Mozart loses interest with him in the second act, or Da Ponte loses interest with him in the second act, and also that because it's a tenor role, the tenor always insists on having both arias. One of the arias was written for a Vienna performance, and one was written for a Prague performance. And Il mio tesoro is a very beautiful aria, but doesn't emerge at all from the dramatic circumstances. It's an interruption. It's like, let's stop time, do this aria. But I also think doing both arias is a mistake.
But I asked because I wondered whether this quote, or maybe a misquote, ever backfired and got you into trouble with directors or conductors saying, you're the one saying Mozart is boring, I'll show you.
Only that a director called David McVicker, pretty soon after I'd said it, because it was published in the Guardian newspaper, he was doing a Friends event at Covent Garden, and I think he was feeling a little bit elevated, and he just said that I didn't know how to sing and that I didn't understand Mozart. And but he has his own view. So.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a point to be made for somebody with my temperament as a singer that I find Mozart on the whole much more difficult than Baroque music or Romantic music. Classical music for me is the sort of sense of equipoise and balance and effortless beauty that is part of the classical aesthetic. I find that much more difficult to identify with emotionally. I mean, I sing some of that music. I like singing some of that music, but I don't feel it offers me the most opportunities for what I can do well.
I mean, I'm wandering deep into cliché country now, but thinking about music on a concentrated level and being a tenor doesn't add up at all times. Somehow, maybe because you're sort of the exception. I found another quote saying that big brain tenors are rare in classical music. So you are one of the bright exceptions to this prejudice.
I mean, I find singers, almost without exception, incredibly very intelligent about what they do, even if they're not, particularly intellectual about it, or even if they're not, educated if they don't have, I don't know. I've got a doctorate, which makes me sort of Mr. Intellectual, but I don't think that helps my performance. But I think one of the things about being a tenor, I think, and I don't know, with the voice I've got, or with the voice I was given, I probably could have developed it in a different direction. It's probably lies quite high, and if I had a less angst-ridden approach to performance, then I could have been singing. Maybe I could have been singing Donizetti and Rossini. But I don't think I would have found that very interesting, and I don't think it would have suited me temperamentally. But I think that the best temperament for a tenor who wants to have a career singing the sort of mainstream tenor repertoire is to have your feet on the ground and not get too worked up. Because all the way through singing tenor repertoire, you have to think, I mustn't get too emotionally involved. I've got to back off here. Because I've got to keep the whole instrument low and relaxed. And that doesn't work for all sorts of music. So.
Since you're a few days above 32, have you started thinking about what it's going to be like when your voice gets older, when it maybe gets lower, are you afraid of ending up like Domingo singing baritone roles? Is there a point you make for yourself to say, okay, that's the end, I'm doing this, but I won't go any further? Or is this something that doesn't bother you at all?
It doesn't really bother me. I mean, there's a really weird phenomenon, which is people, it happened to me the other day. I went to dinner and met some new people, and they could be incredibly personal and rude and say to you, well, how long are you going to go on singing? Which I think, how long are you going to go on being a civil servant? How long do you think you'll be able to manage that mentally? I'm always encouraged by what people who know about it say. I came up today in my singing lesson. I wasn't asking about it, but my singing teacher said, it's really interesting that the latest research suggests that, the cartilage around here starts to thicken when you're in your 70s. And until then, you can continue developing as a singer. And even after then, you can still sing, clearly. Mm-hmm. I think if you choose the right repertoire, and if you're singing song, you can sing in any keys you want. As long as you're doing something that's artistically interesting, that's fine. And I don't want to give up until it's, and I'm also quite used to the phenomenon of people with very ugly voices giving very, very great performances. So, I think one of the greatest singers in pop music is Bob Dylan, and it's a hideous voice. So it's a question of how you manage taste, because it doesn't always, obviously in certain repertoire, that doesn't work. And I'm singing more, and it's interesting to be singing more. I've been singing jazz with a jazz pianist called Brad Mehldau, and that's interesting because it just requires so much less, it's so much more about speaking, really. Not giving too much voice and using the microphone and blah, 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 blah. So I don't think I'm really concerned about it particularly. And at the moment, my voice, particularly because of COVID, we've all been sort of singing less, and I think that's been good for all of us. We've all been singing less, going to teachers more, and I think my voice doesn't feel overused at the moment. It has all sorts of technical things I have to deal with, but in terms of the freshness of the voice in its sort of core, I think it's relatively not abused at the moment. But I think that's the other thing about doing opera. I mean, opera singers are having to fight with enormous orchestras, all the time, and doing endless rehearsals and then shows. And I think it can be very, very wearing on the voice, and I'm glad I haven't had to go through that.
Since you mentioned opera, what's the best way for a conductor or a music director or an opera director to get you really mad? I once spoke to Hilary Hahn, and she said the worst thing that a conductor can say to her is, trust me.
I can't think of anything general, actually. Just if they interfere, I just think conductors should show it's the people who are playing or singing respect and not interfere too much. I mean, the conductor's role is the most difficult thing I think to do as a conductor. It's what somebody like Bernard Haitink was so good at is to be an accompanist, because then you're really having to bring the orchestra with. You're the intermediary between the singer and the conductor, and between the singer and the orchestra, and you're having to get the orchestra to be as malleable and as much on the singer's breath as a great pianist is when you sing lead repertoire. So I think that's what you're looking for in a conductor, I suppose.
Speaking about repertoire, I mean, you have a very broad repertoire. You've done recently you've done a Respighi recording. Now you're coming to Hamburg with Monteverdi. I think there's about 400 years between those two composers. That's a real big stretch of time and stretch of style. How easy is it, or how fast are you to find out what kind of music is something that you don't want to do? Do you have to chew on stuff for a long time to see whether it actually works, or is it first sight love or not at all? And do you need some resistance maybe to get into stuff?
I think it's just that what I can do is quite obvious, and I think in terms of my temperament as a performer, I have quite a romantic temperament, but I'm not going to sing. I sing very little romantic repertoire with orchestra from the 19th century. So I sing the Nuit d'été from sort of the first half of the 19th century, and I sing some Mahler songs, some of which were composed in the 1890s with orchestra. But on the whole, that whole sort of operatic, romantic tradition is something doesn't suit me vocally. But other than that, I sort of see there's a real connection between doing Baroque music and doing Lied, because it's about, a lot of it is about the sort of contrast between line and words and intimacy and drama. And so I don't know, with the Respighi, the pianist who wanted us to do them, she chose someone, and I did fall in love with them straight away. But I think with there's obviously something very much in common for me with all the things I've been doing recently, which is I'm dealing with the Italian language, which is not something that's been a huge part of, well, not a huge part of my life. The German language has been the main language I've sung in. And it's wonderful to have beautiful poetry to sing.
So you never actually missed being a Wagner tenor, shouting for hours and slaying a dragon and stuff like that?
No, I'm always saying, I've been saying this for 20 years, I'd love to sing Lorga in Rheingold, but maybe that will never happen. But I think that's something that would suit me. And I mean, other than that, I don't think.
Can you say where your stage fright is larger, opera, recital, or concert? Or is it equally just the same, or doesn't it exist at all?
I don't think I get stage. I don't think anyone could really survive this long if they had stage fright. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm worried. I get anxious about particular phrases that I feel I can't sing. But that's just to do with It's particularly no stage fright with opera, because I think it's so routine. You've rehearsed so much, and then the curtain goes up, and also you're in this sort of isolated space. You can't really see the audience. It's a very different experience in some ways.
As far as I know, you had lectures about music and magic. Why? I mean, isn't it obvious that musicians are magicians just as well? Or what brought you to this topic?
I think what brought me to the topic was it was a very long time ago, and I was asked to give a lecture at the University of Edinburgh as part of the Edinburgh Festival. And it was probably actually the same, possibly even the same year, my doctoral thesis was published as a book. It was about witchcraft. So I wanted to talk about the connections between magic and music, and there are so many obvious connections. Obvious Renaissance connections with the conception of a universe that's ordered by harmony, and then the sort of absorption of that into the natural philosophical scientific tradition through the course of the 17th century. But then in the 18th century, a very sort of mechanistic idea of music itself, of music as a sort of affective practice. And it's only, again, at the beginning of the 19th century that you get something, a sort of return of the metaphysical into music, with people like Schopenhauer, and the idea that music can has this sort of relationship to the nature of reality and the nature of being. And I think, obviously, we've lost that again, and music is... But it's interesting that there's a sort of echo of Renaissance theory and some of quantum mechanics and things like, string theory is all about harmony. That was what I was just talking about in a very ill-disciplined way about the connections between music and magic.
Okay. It's quite not possible to talk with you or to do an interview with you without mentioning the Schubert book. And I read it and I was really fascinated by it, and I found it so knowledgeable and so such a broad perspective. I wondered how easy or how complicated was it for you to write this? Did you take your time off? Was it just in between performances and journeys, or did you really enjoy being back to university somehow and doing something to concentrate and to focus on something? I wondered how this actually took place to finally become a book.
Well, look, I mean, what happened was I wrote my book on witchcraft, which was published in 1997, and I finished that while I was becoming a singer. So I thought, writing books and being a singer is jolly easy. But actually, there wasn't enough time. And then I wrote an introduction to a book of leader texts for the publisher Faber, and that went quite well. And then the publisher said, would you like to, wonderful publisher Belinda Matthews said, would you like to write something else? And I said, well, I've been doing a lot of writing of columns for magazines and long pieces for your books or CD notes, and maybe we could collect those as a volume of essays. So we did that. And that did quite well. And then she said, well, what else can you do? And I talked to my wife, who's a writer, Augusta Miller, about it. And we both agreed that the writing about Winterreise would be a really good way of writing a book, because I already knew a lot about it. It fell very obviously into 24 sections, so I didn't have to think about the structure or how to make it unified, which I think is one of the biggest tasks in writing a book. And it meant also I could do it in bits, and I did a lot of it while I was travelling. I remember I think I wrote the first sentence when I was at the Resor Festival with Leopold Ansnes. And it did mean sometimes going back to the library, which I loved, and calling up obscure things. But it was a nice process of writing, because I knew how to do it. What I did was I would translate the poem for myself to make sure I was really engaged with the text, and then that would be the big things that emerged from that would be how I started writing, and then I just follow my nose, and certain things would crop up, musical things, but then things that weren't musical at all, sort of connections. Very often pictures would help me to write, pictures that seem connected. So it's I wrote it. I didn't take time off to write it.
Did the success scare you off to do further projects? It was a success. Reviews were great. The response was great. And I think you knew pretty well and pretty fast that this is something good and lasting. And if you do something as good as this, then it's harder to get to the next project. So was this a problem for you?
It might be. I don't know. I haven't yet. I've just written a book based on some lectures that I gave at the University of Chicago, but it's not the same sort of thing. And at the moment, I can't think of I'm coming up with ideas, but I still think the Winterreise book was a particularly good idea. But I didn't think that at the time. When I wrote it, I remember Julius Drake, my friend, the bin, saying, "Oh, this is going to do so well." And I said, "Well, the audience for classical music is very small," and blah 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 blah. I was incredibly lucky with my publishers. I had an American publisher, a Scottish woman called Carol Janeway, the great Germanophile translator of German literature into English, who worked for Knopf in New York, and she got me connected to the sort of cream of European publishers. So it was published by Detlef Felken at C.H. Beck in Munich. It was published in Finnish, in Spanish, in French. So it ended up being published in 12 or 13 different countries, which was a great thing. But you often feel, I sometimes feel, the peak of I'm 57 now, and I think I'll have lots of other interesting things to do, but I can't think of anything much better than what happened at the end of, I think it was the end of 2014, the beginning of 2015, where I published the book. It was being broadcast on the radio. It got really good reviews. And I did Winterreise at the Barbican Hall in London, which is an enormous hall. And originally they were just going to sell seats in stores. And, it's only a song recital. And in the end, because of all this publicity, they sold out the whole hall. And it was very, very, in a very childish way, very exciting.
Is there any chance that you could express in one sentence what's so special and fascinating about Schubert's Winterreise? I wouldn't be able to form one sentence, but why is this music so eternally interesting?
I think partly it's the gaps between the notes. It's so simple that it leaves a lot of space for us to think and to that's one of the. I mean, it's a mystery, of course, as well. I mean, it's a mystery in the way that modulations in Schubert for some reason modulations from the minor to the major in Schubert are incredibly sad and beautiful, and it's how he timed. I suppose it's all about timing. It's like being a good stand-up comic. Exactly when to do that thing. But I think with Winterreise on the whole, it's the space between the notes, leaving space for us to project onto this sort of white, snowy emptiness. And so it's had an enormous impact, I think, on every generation since it was written.
Since you're coming to Hamburg with Monteverdis L'Orfeo, one or the big first opera that's remained to be known, I always wonder when I hear Monteverdis, why does it feel so fresh and so current and so like today, even much more than many other operas from later centuries? Yeah. I mean, Monteverdis is not complicated. It's simple in a way, but it is tricky, and it is a complete different world of feelings and expressions than what we're used to. And nevertheless, this music, which is 500 years old, seems to be talking more directly than many 18th century operas in a way.
Yeah. Gosh, I don't really know. It may be that that particular period is very close to us in some way. I mean, it's interesting that it's the same period as it's not the same year as Hamlet, but it's very close to Hamlet. And it's a very powerful, very simple, iconic story. It's not, I mean, so many 18th century operas are about, Central Asian kings and Alexander the Great's incursions into Central Asia, or they're not things that necessarily, I mean, and they're quite formulaic. Whereas I think that the myth of Orfeo has a very, very strong emotional pull on us, and this idea of losing the thing that you love because you've made this terrible error. And what was this terrible error? Was this terrible error to love too much? Or was it to be narcissistic? Or was it to be greedy? And we've all experienced losing in that way, I think. And so I think it has an iconic power. As for the music, it's so various. You have. I mean, if you go to musicologists, they'll analyze it and say, well, this is a 5-part madrigal and this is the piece of recitative. And it doesn't feel like that. It just feels like this thing that just expands and opens as you go along. And even the most difficult parts, I think the Act 5 recitative, it's very long. I mean, is it 6 or 8 pages long? It's sort of relentless, quite intense recitative. But I think it's very moving. And usually, in 18th century opera, we think, oh God, here comes the recitative. I'll just switch off for 5 minutes until the next aria. It's not like that.
I was wondering, because I've seen you here in Hamburg doing La Passione at Deichtorhallen with Kent Nagano, this big production with Castellucci. Yeah. What was that like, rehearsing it and actually performing it? I mean, a bus crossing the stage, this big tree moving across the stage. Was it like a big box of wonders being there on stage, or were you so focused on singing Bach that you didn't really notice anything?
It was sort of problematic. I mean, I think I would have liked it as an audience member, but I don't think I was particularly well suited to it as a conception, because when I perform the Evangelist, I'm very dramatic, and really, the point of me doing the Evangelist is that I'm performing to the audience and connecting with them. And in that production, I had absolutely no. They might as well have put a CD on. It was really an installation, and it was a very dry acoustic. We were behind these things, so being pulled across the stage in front of us, so the audience couldn't really connect with us. So on the whole, for me, it wasn't a particularly useful experience, I would say.
Okay, because everybody in the audience just sat there and wondering what's going to come next. How are they going to top a bus being moved along the stage, a whole travel bus?
I think it's a nice idea to have an installation, but I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure I was the right singer for it. I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know. It was. I think it was. I liked it as a production, but I wouldn't say that I was totally. It wasn't as stimulating as giving a concert performance, probably for me as a performer, because of this lack of connection with the audience.
I see. This might sound a bit strange, but sometimes when I read texts I've written, I think from a distance they're quite good. How is your connection with being on stage? Are you sometimes moved by what you're doing so much that you really are moved, or is this? Do you have to stick to professionalism and not being touched by your own doings and your own music? I don't know what it's like when you're on stage and having a really brilliant performance, whether it touches you like it's touching the audience, or whether still there's a distance between you producing what you're doing and the audience reacting to what they're getting from you.
I think the response from you as a performer is very different from the response the audience receives. But for me, there's no distance, and the performances that work are ones where you feel totally that you are an expressive instrument. I mean, this is intellectualizing it too much, but it's what they say about the singer becomes the song. You become so totally enwrapped in the music that it's like a sort of shamanic experience of sort of being at one with this thing that you're producing, and it all comes together and it flows without. It just seems natural, and I think that's when it's best for the audience. But it's certainly when it's best for the performer, because you feel at one with the material you're delivering. I never feel like I'm a professional who's keeping a distance, and I mean maybe that's the problem for me with vocal technique. Is sometimes you're supposed to keep a distance because your body mustn't become too involved, because you're supposed to be thinking about all the singing stuff. But actually, the only way I can perform is to be at one with the material.
You mentioned coming from singing lessons.
The performer I most admire, if I had to choose between Joan Sutherland singing perfectly and Maria Callas singing sometimes quite badly, I choose Maria Callas every time, because she's totally inside what she's doing. And it's not that she's listening to herself and being moved by herself, it's just that she's inside what's going on. That would always be an ideal for me.
Since you mentioned taking singing lessons, you said yourself you're 57 now, you're taking lessons. I couldn't think of piano virtuosos or violin virtuosos still taking lessons at that age. And it's completely nothing that should sound weird. I was just wondering whether it's completely natural for you to still be a pupil and to still know I still have to learn after decades of a career. Or are these lessons more like controlling and taking care, like getting your car into the car shop and tell the guy there to check the tires?
It's a bit like that. I mean, it's much more than that. I think the really wonderful thing about the voice is that it continues. Your body changes, and so things change, and you have to. Some things that used to be easy become more difficult, and some things that used to be difficult become more easy. And the instrument is inside you, so you want somebody to tell you what they're hearing. So I think it's really important to carry on having that, and it's wonderful for me that I know in lots of ways I'm singing better than I was 20 years ago. So partly from having these lessons, and partly from not having sung quite so much over the past 2 years.
Did you actually miss your audience during these months where nearly nothing was possible, or did you feel like I can use this break just to recharge my batteries?
No, I felt terrible. I thought it was awful. I mean, I should have been over. I mean, I had this book to write. I was teaching in Munich. It was online, which was, and I could have been rational about it and thought, well, but I didn't like not performing. And when I've had opportunities to perform normally, which is pretty rare. I mean, I've done a lot of performance over the past 2 years, but a lot of it has been with people wearing masks or half-empty halls. But I did a Winterreise in the autumn in the Opera House in Ghent, and it was full, and nobody was wearing a mask, and it was just like sort of manna from heaven. It was so much more like a real connection with the audience and a real experience of performing.
Do you think there's any good in? Do you think there's any good in these two lost years on the long run for the art scene, like having to reinvent yourself, or is it just a plain catastrophe?
I tend to think it's a plain catastrophe because the things that people were trying to say would be great. It's nonsense. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, "Well, this is great because art has got to be about access, and it's great if we can do streaming because we will reach so many more people." And it's just a complete misunderstanding of the nature of performing art. I mean, if we want to have performing art, it has to be something that means a connection between real people, and that's you're not going to get that through streaming.
Mm. I can't hear you quite well, but I hope you hear me.
Yes, I'll move a bit closer. Sorry.
Okay. How hard is it for you to find a piano accompanist, and how hard for you is it to stick with him after you've made up your mind?
I work with different people, and I've found lots of wonderful people to work with. I mean, I've worked with Julia Straight now for 30 years this year. This November, I will have worked with him for 30 years. So that's
a decent marriage in a way.
Yeah, and it has all the challenges of a just ask Julius. But it's not, and I found other people that I work with a lot. I've worked a lot over the past 5 years with an amazing Italian-Dutch pianist called Saskia Giorgini, who introduced me to the work of Respighi and who is amazing in the Lied repertoire. And we do, we do Winterreise she plays without the score, which I think it somehow creates a different feeling for us, but I think it also makes the audience listen in a different way. I've been working a lot recently with Lars Vogt, both as a pianist and a conductor, and that's been so. No, I'm really lucky that I have access to lots of inspiring people.
Since I'm never in this position, I wonder what it's like to prepare a Liederabend, finding out who is right, who is wrong, who has the right opinion about taking a certain moment of a piece. Is it like a challenge? Is it like, okay, you get one, I get one? How do you manage to find solutions when everybody in this duo combination naturally seems to be thinking or should be thinking, I'm the one who knows how it goes?
I think it's just if you're working with someone who's experienced and has good ears and a feeling for the repertoire, it's something that happens organically, and it doesn't really very often involve much discussion. It's an invisible negotiation in while you're working. I mean, occasionally there are issues about tempo, and the singer is very fortunately always has an excuse. But they can always say, I can't do it because of the breath or something. I mean, because singers are more fragile than pianists in so many ways. They have a trump card they can always play to get their way, which probably really annoys the pianist. But for me, I find with most of the people I work with that we have a common approach to phrasing, which is the most important thing in this music, and we don't adopt strange tempi in order to do something different. The phrasing emerges quite naturally.
Hmm. Talking about cycles, just let me see. There it is. In my cupboard. Schumann, alle Lieder. Christian Gerhaher. He recorded every song by Schumann, and I think it's about 300 songs. Would you be interested to record all 600 of Schubert, or is it just too obsessive to start such a project?
I would be sort of interested. I mean, I've recorded a lot already, and I suppose, but I do like to record things that I've performed, I suppose, on the whole. And what I've recorded, I did 4 CDs for the Wigmore Hall of recital, all Schubert recital programs that I developed with Julius over 20 years. And that was nice because they form like cycles in a way. And I'm not sure that being encyclopedic necessarily always brings out the best performance. Because for me, the best performances are very dramatic. I mean, and I think you can bring that across on a CD. It's interesting the difference between songs I've recorded in the studio where I've been trying to achieve some sort of perfection and ones where I've been doing it in a recital and it's come out of a whole context, a whole dramatic context of what the song was before and what the song is afterwards, a bit like a song in Winterreise. So I don't think I have an encyclopedic urge, but the more I can record, the better, quite honestly. And I haven't recorded enough Schumann. I mean, I've done the Heine cycles a long time ago. I did Myrten with Dorothea Weschmann. And I would like to do, I haven't recorded the Liederkreis Opus 39, which I really ought to do, and the Cannon Lieder and the Anderson Lieder. So that's something I'd like to do.
I saved one of the most stupid questions maybe for coming to an end. You're doing Winterreise here in Hamburg with Papano in May. Isn't this completely awkward to sing Winterreise in May? Shouldn't it be done in winters only?
No, because I've done it in incredible. The hottest performance was in the Cartagena Festival in Colombia, and we had to tell them to turn it was in January, so it was very, 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 very hot. And we had to ask them to turn. This was with Saskia Giorgini. We had to tell them to turn off the air conditioning because it was too noisy. It was about 35, I think. And then I went straight from Cartagena to Montreal to sing Winterreise with Angela Hewitt, and it was minus 30. So I think it works in all sorts of physical conditions because it's about a state of mind, not about the weather.
I hope for an answer like this.
That's a very obvious answer.
Yeah, but you had to say it. I just had to ask. Did you get it in your mind already to start conducting, to start directing pieces, to going back to academic life? Are there any ideas brewing inside you that you think, oh, I've seen so many conductors doing things, I've seen so many directors doing things on stage, what the heck, I'll try it?
I think there's a very bad, on the whole, very bad record of singers becoming conductors. And I remember there's a wonderful agent called Martin Campbell-White who discovered Simon Rattle years and years and years ago and has discovered a lot of conductors in the past 30 years. And he said he made me promise never to become a conductor because singers. And it's interesting that, Fischer Dieskau was such a great musician, such a great singer, and apparently was not at all a successful conductor. So I do, you do want to. I do so often feel I know how this goes, and I wanted to go like this, and this isn't how it should go. But whether the question is then how you convert that into economical use of rehearsal time, for example. How do you convey your idea in the limited amount of time that you have? I mean, being a conductor is about so many things. It's not just about having the idea. And I'm aware of also how difficult directing is because I've worked with some genius. Well, I worked with Deborah Warner, who is, when at her best, is an absolute genius director. And it's I'm going to maybe stage something in Italy later this year, and I'll see how that goes. But I mean, something very, very simple.
Okay.
But I think, directing in a way is really also, it's about telling people, it's about helping people to produce a good performance. So maybe that is something that one can do. It's not about it's not necessarily about the design or the mise en scène. The most important thing is the sort of Personenregie, which is about enabling, I suppose.
Okay, so I'll come to my last question. And which voice would you prefer in the next life, if not a tenor?
Well, not a castrato. But probably I always wanted to be a baritone, and I used to sing along. When I was a teenager, I used to sing along to the Fischer Disco records, probably giving myself enormous vocal problems, which is probably why I'm still going to a teacher to try and sort out the problems I created by copying Fischer Disco. So I suppose I'd want to be a baritone.
It's
a hard life being a baritone because it's very competitive.
I expected being a bass, so finally getting the chance to being a bad guy.
Yes, I think being a bass, my impression, talking to people like, who was it I was talking to? Robert Lloyd. He just gave me the impression that being a bass is just incredibly easy. He said, I hardly ever have to sing above the passaggio. I can smoke and drink. And
perfect life.
Yeah, perfect life.
Yeah. You made a big mistake in your early years, choosing to become a tenor then.
Well, there's no choice, unfortunately. But being a bass is also very rare, isn't it? Being a real bass. And it is an extraordinary thing to have that sonority.
Okay, so that's on your to-do list for the next life then. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing you and hearing you in the Monteverdi production and as well in the Winterreise, even if it's in May. And take care. And who knows who's going.
Der Mai war mir gewogen mit manchen Blumenstrauß.
Genau. Alles klar. So vielen Dank and thank you very much and goodbye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Weitere Podcasts vom Hamburger Abendblatt finden Sie auf abendblatt.de/podcast.